theyeshiva.net.
Okay, so we're in the Maamar V'Yadaita, Moskva, Tovrish Nun Zayin, page Nun Aleph. 8 lines from the top. V'yesh la b'chinas erich v'shaychus l'olamus. After explaining at length the method of communication between the mentor and the pupil, the teacher and the disciple, where in order to communicate the wisdom, the truth, in a way that can be internalized and absorbed within the containers, the capacity and the structure, physiological, mental and emotional and cognitive and spiritual structure of the student, the teacher must filter, channel, and most importantly restrict the flow, as explained at length, and often employ parables, metaphors, allegories, to transport the idea to a much lower level, to concretize it, maybe even to make it more coarse, more brute, which is more tangible for the world, for the Weltanschauung of the student to appreciate it. And then he could slowly strip the layers and go back upward from the mashal to the nimshal. In a process he calls Ur Chayzer versus Ur Yasher. That was the mashal. And the nimshal, we now can appreciate the concepts of Shem Havaya and Shem Elikim with more clarity, meaning that Shem Yudke Vavke represents the source of Gilui, what we call in Kabbalistic or Hasidic language Ur. Ur again is a metaphor, but it's a metaphor. Ur means light. Light ultimately is a very intangible property, but it's on some level a physical property. We appreciate it, we feel it, we know it, we experience it in so many different ways. It's one of the most important sustaining forces of life on our planet and in our lives, our personal lives as well. And hence, Ur itself is a metaphor. And what is it a metaphor? It's a metaphor for the Gilui. And when we want to speak about Yudke Vavke, we call it the Ur. What is the Ur? The Ur represents the revelation, the expression of infinity. Ur me'ein hamoyer and Ur davik b'moyer. And thus, Ur and the worlds can't really coexist because the worlds are based on identity and finiteness. On the other hand, to conceal the Ur and just block it, you're not going to have a world. Creation comes from expression, from the koyach hapoyel, the power of the activator being manifested in whatever he or she wants to create. Restrain is a very powerful quality, but nothing happens outside of you from restrain. Restrain means you just retreat into yourself. You're restraining, you're holding on to your koyach. So just from concealment, you can't have a world. Because what is concealment? Concealment is just a blockage. So you need the expression of koyach hapoyel. And this is where we have the challenge, because the Ur Ein Sof is infinite. So Shem Elikim is like the, so to speak, the mashal that the teacher introduces into the class. It's the restrictive garments that harness and limit and block and concretize and restrict the energy of the Ein Sof, that only an external ray should emerge. And this is where Kalim come in, meaning that the Ur is manifested in Kalim, which give it a shape and give it a mold and give it a color and give it a dimension. Again, we're talking about spiritual colors and spiritual dimensions, and it becomes divisible. We could say there's Chachma and there's Chesed and so forth.
Question?
Yeah.
The other names of Hashem that are discussed in Baba Basra, in the character, the first paragraph, do those names also have the same faculty or limiting ability to recall that?
Right, very good question. What about the other names of Hashem? So indeed, each name, right, represents a certain channel of energy. Right. In Sefer HaPardes, the book of Pardes Rimonim, which means the orchard of pomegranates, that was authored by one of the great Kabbalists, the Ramak, Rabbi Rabbeinu Moshe Cordovero, who was a teacher of the Arizal in the 1500s in Svas. He passed away in 1570. So he has a sefer called Pardes. It's an encyclopedic Kabbalistic work, and there he goes through Shar Hashemus, the unique quality based on the Zohar and other writings, the unique quality and characteristic of each one of the names. In fact, each one of the names represents what we would call another sphera. Here he mentions Chachma, Chesed, and so forth. So each one of them represents a particular characteristic that, so to speak, filters and channels the energy through a particular keli.
Yeah, just one other question.
Yes.
Focusing on the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the 42-letter name, is that actually the Grega beyond?
Yeah. So he says, V'yesh lebchinas erech v'shayches la'olamus. Now the energy is one that can have a relationship to the worlds, like the teacher, when he filters and channels and concretizes the idea in a metaphor. Now the students, the photosynthesis process can happen. Now the student opens up and can receive it, can absorb it. There's an erech, there's a relationship, there's a shayches.
Energy and R are interchangeable?
It's just various, I think, English words that, somehow convey a little bit of the concept.
Energy is in one part of the word.
Huh?
The word
Part of light is that it's energy.
Just energy, and the way to transmit it. So the energy is part of it.
This is exactly what we explained about the seichel hamitzumtzum. The teacher wants to give, he doesn't want to hold back. He wants to teach, he wants to mentor. He wants the truths to be communicated. The whole Hester is a chelik of the Gilui. But it's the seichel hamitzumtzum shel hamashpia. It's the restricted seichel. It's the channeled seichel. It's the diluted seichel that could come to the makabel kol it's lefi erka. Lefi erka means it's commensurate with him. There's a connection there. Va'achar kach, that's step one. And then there's many other steps. Then there's something called, in keli itself, just like we have in the physical keli, the pnimius of the kli, the inside. The chitzonius kli is the outside. So he says, through something called chitzon. Before he just spoke about kelim. That kelim contain the oil, right? He said, ha'arazumis labeshas bekelim the esosphere is the Atzilus. In Atzilus, the concept of Atzilus, which is the first universe, it's a divine universe, is that there's Oiris and Kalim. Prior to Atzilus, so to speak, there's no Kalim. There's just Oir. In other words, there's no finiteness. There's no tzimtzum of the Oir. It's just pure infinity. Atzilus is the first place, so to speak, where there's a marriage of Oir and Kali, which allows there to be a world. But it's still the world of Atzilus. He says, then there's something called Chitzonius HaKelim, the external element of a kli. Vayidei parsa, and then there's something called a parsa, which means a veil, a muscle. Hamavsekes, which separates further the earth. Bein Atzilus libri yitzir asiyah, between Atzilus and what would become the lower worlds. Nimshach, as a result of these, nimshach lefi erech olam is bali gvul. Now there's a whole new type of oir. That the new oir is actually one that is commensurate with finite universes. Lahavas olam is briya yitzirasi. Chuli. And the chuli, of course, is every stage requires a new type of keli, and a new type of parsa, a new type of vessel, and a new type of veil, in order to make the oir commensurate and accessible and custom-made to the world, to the reality that needs to emerge into existence.
So why can't he just speak of Kalim and Masach? Why does he have to invoke his Chalkas, the Chisonius again? Why is it necessary to introduce this concept?
What's the Chitzonius HaKelim? So very briefly, just like when we speak in a physical Kelim, we have, again, we're going to use a mashal. That's how we use mashalim constantly. There's the pnimius of a kli, take a cup, right? There's the inside of the cup, and then the outside of the cup. The inside of the cup, or any keli, its function is to contain the liquid that the cup is supposed to contain, or whatever this utensil is supposed to contain. That's the pnimius. The chitzonius hakeli is basically the part I have access to. I don't grasp usually the pnimius hakeli, whether there's a handle or there's no handle. You grasp the outside of the keli, and that gives you access to the vessel. So if you want to speak about this in more abstract language, The Pnimius HaKeli is a metaphor for that aspect of the Keli that its entire identity is just to carry and hold on to the light. The Chitzonius HaKeli, on the other hand, is already how the Keli allows others to use it and benefit from it. Okay? I have access to the Kli. So in spiritual or more abstract thought, that's a mashal for two different types of aspects of Kelim. One is a Keli that indeed contains the light, but its entire identity is just a channel, a vessel, a receptacle for the light. Chitzonius HaKeli would mean that here the light gets obscured even more because the focus is not just a channel for the light. The focus rather becomes one that allows for something outside. I'm holding on to the Kli. My entire identity is not drinking coffee. Sometimes a person likes coffee very much. Now the Keli is actually serving me. I'm not serving the Keli. So Chitzonius HaKeli is already, so to speak, a stage lower in the evolution.
So you shouldn't need Chitzonius HaKeli in Atzilus.
Right.
That's pure spiritual.
So in Atzilus, the whole identity of Chachma and Chesed is just a channel for the Oyer. But from that, you're not going to get a lower type of consciousness. And so in each world, in each sphere, there's like this process of, this is what we call Seder Hishtalshlus, the process of evolution. It's really devolution. It's really not evolution, it's devolution. From pure divine energy, it devolves into metaphors. There's like a metaphor for a metaphor for a metaphor for a metaphor. And each one concretizes the divine energy more and more. And it loses that original intensity, which is infinite and indivisible. So it starts off with Atzilus, but then it goes, there's Bria, and there's Yitzira, and there's Asiya. And you're doing it with endless metaphors and endless containers. It's not 5 or 10 or 20. He says Chulu, but it includes every stage, every sphere, every middah, every world, and each world itself. There's endless layers of consciousness until we come to this world, Asiya. And in our world itself, every person is in a different state of consciousness. How you perceive reality is not how I perceive reality, right? God's light emerges through every existence in its own unique way. The common denominator in this world is that atheism is welcome. This is the first world where atheism is actually very, you can receive, you could be guaranteed a tenure in a very prestigious university as a result of your unwavering dedication to atheism.
So is perception...
That's the common denominator in this world. But you still, you still can't compare the state of consciousness in a rhinoceros, right, to the state of consciousness in a chimpanzee, to the state of consciousness in a human lahavdil, to the state of consciousness in a blade of grass, to the state of consciousness in a grain of sand, even though there's consciousness in each. On one level or another, what we see or what we don't see, simply looking at the atomic level of it and the atomic structure, we know how much life and movement and action and creativity exists even in the tiniest flake of snow or molecule of water or coffee. But the common denominator in this world is that the Kalim have completely filtered out the Ur to the point that you may not even feel Ur. Yes, was something about sagen?
How does the Chitzonius can make a difference? The Ikil is what's inside. How can it be different from Chitzonius?
The word Chitzonius is just a mashal. It's a mashal. The word Keli is also a mashal.
Well, but Keli contains, so you can contain more, you can contain less. But the Chitzonius is not an object.
No, Chitzonius is an object. If you look like this, and if you go to our Armani store, and they will change you in a completely different look, people will perceive you differently. Content didn't change, but people will perceive you completely different.
But the amount, how much you can contain, can be different. But the outside...
It's like a screen. Think about it of a screen, right? He's channeling it through a screen. And you could see the screen from inside, you could see the screen from outside.
From our perspective, isn't the Chitzonius equally important because it's the only way we can...
Of course. Chitzonius HaKeli is extremely important. That's what he says is the channel from the higher worlds to the lower worlds. The fact that the Ur now is filtered through something called Chitzonius HaKeli. Let me put it in simpler words. Just think of it as metaphors. It's just metaphors to be able to grasp it. So we use words like oir and keli and pnimius and chitzonius. It's simply mashalim. That's the very terminology is it's essential to understand when we employ this terminology. The terminology at best is a mashal, and usually also not a perfect mashal, but at best it's a mashal. So it's just strip it from the mashal. Sometimes you have to strip it from the mashal to make it clear, right? A little more abstract. There's two ways in which the oir can be communicated. One we call pnimiyus hakli. It's going through a kli, but one we call through pnimiyus hakli, one we call through chitzonius hakli. What is the message here? Now forget these words for a moment. What is the message here? One can communicate a very, very intense light also through vessels and channels. Also through containers, that's why we call it kalim. But we're focusing on pnimius versus chitzonius. So this would mean one could channel the oir and limit the oir, right? But there is a sense that the entire focus here is the oir. Elamai, I want to channel the oir. Then there is, the oir goes through even a more intense process, where the focus becomes not so much the oir, the focus becomes on those who are receiving it. So it's different processes in the tzimtzum, different phases in the descent itself. Yeah.
Is the Chitzonius apparently can take many shapes, right? Is there such thing as an ideal Chitzonius, like when the Pnimis always begun, and you see this is the Pnimis? Is there such an external Chitzonius that you can say, oh, that's the Pnimis, that nobody can make a mistake? Or it's like...
I'm sure there is that itself.
Is there such thing? So it's
Yeah.
be like a clean because there Chitzonius doesn't exist, right?
Or much less, it's tuffle to the pnimius. It's subservient to the pnimius hakli.
Emotional, it could be in this world as well, right? So when the pnimius comes out completely, so it's you will see that's the emes.
Yeah. If you remember, we learned once Torah Parshas Noach about Akudim, and Brudim, and he discusses over there that you have a keli, but sometimes the whole identity of the keli recognizes itself as just a channel for the oir. That's what pnimis hakeli is. That's what his identity is. So his chachma. What is chachma? What is chesed? It's just a channel for Ein Sof being manifested through this way. The chachma itself doesn't occupy space. In chitzonius hakeli, the characteristics itself, the identity, overpowers the indivisible energy. We're in the higher place, in pnimius hakeli, the identity is just a channel for the infinite energy.
To use a very brute mashal, chesed as an abstract quality, that loving kindness can exist without anything to apply the loving kindness to. And then, as it's channeled down, when there's an other to receive it, it takes on a more...
Right. Concrete form.
Can you have a good Jew at heart who doesn't do anything? Or can you have chesed without action?
Either like the object or stove.
Well, he may have not found it, like it says Avram Avinu was aggravated because there were no guests.
I was wondering how those channels that are referred to in the Torah or Noah, Parshas Noah, that you mentioned, how they relate to this concept of tzimtzum and also what you call evolution.
Yeah. So over there he speaks about three worlds, Akudim, Nekudim, and Brudim, right? So he says that Akudim, all the Oiris are in one Keli. And the Kudim, they're completely distinct, but they're too intense for each other, so they break. It's called Toyo. And then Brudim, there's integration, which is Atzilus. But the point is, in the highest level, he speaks that there's only one Kli, because the whole Keli is completely a channel for the Ur, so there's no sense of divisibility. Here we're already speaking that there is divisibility. It's already Atzilus. It's what's called Brudim in the context of that Maamar. But my point is that with each level, what we call levels is basically means... mitigated states of consciousness as a result of the keli that gives rise to this type of existence. Let's put it this way. And here again, the mashal and the nimshal can't be accurate. When we think of a teacher and a student, we never think as the teacher creating the essence of the student. The student is an individual who has his own life, his own mind, his own soul, his own body, his own story, where he comes from. And at some point in life, the two people met, and one is influencing the other, one is receiving from the other, and a relationship begins. So when we speak about Mishalim and Tzimtzumim and Halemus, it's all for the information to go from one brain into another brain. Let him speak. I can be quiet. I don't mind. Can sein still. Maybe he'll be better.
He will catch up with you in 5 seconds.
But now, let's think something else. Now, think about this marshal, because it's a little abstract, just a little, a mental stretch, perhaps. What if a mentor is sitting with a teacher, and the type of information he gives him is going to create him from scratch? It's not going to teach him a shtickle Gemara or teach him how to think. This information is going to create him. Yes, like computer programmers. Like computer programmers, right? To create the robot. Those who are creating artificial intelligent creatures who are soon going to replace 80% of our workforce. And that's when the Rambam says, Lo yiyeh eisa kol ha'olam ela l'dasas Hashem b'lvad. In the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Malachim. You're not creating just an idea that's going into him. What if your idea is actually fashioning the entire identity? Right? So now think about it. The way the teacher gives the shiur is the way the product, the creation emerges. It's a different type of creation. If he concretizes the idea in a much more tangible fashion, it's a different type of student than if the idea remains up there. It's a completely different place. And remember, the student doesn't know any of this. Again, the mashal falls short. In the mashal, there's an active relationship. In the nimshal, when we speak about the energy and the kelim, it's not just a mashal to get it to the keli. It's the that creates the keli. It's the that creates the worlds. So there are endless states of consciousness that is all based on one thing. What is the vessel that your identity basically is based on? It's a completely different way of understanding it. That's where the mashal falls so short. It's a good mashal, but the mashal doesn't capture this detail. The Rav doesn't create the Talmud. Here, the Keli is the essence of the world. The chemistry, the essence, physically, emotionally, spiritually, every aspect of the particular nivra is what? Is a product of the type of Keli that channeled the oir in order to create this type of world. And in this, no two things are the same. What if there would be absolutely no Kalim? There would be no distinctive consciousness. It would all be one. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as is, infinite. Where some of you wanted to go at some stage in your life. Still do. What do the Kalim accomplish? That every single nivra, every world has its own Keli, and hence the language would be what is the type of Keli that you're defined by? Okay, now I'm going to give another mashal, which brings it from the functional to the dysfunctional, because at this point it's all functional, just different states of consciousness. But let's talk about the dysfunctional. Yeah, some people sitting here know this story very well. Grow up with a certain perception of themselves. All information that they ever access in their life is channeled through a certain prism. Both prism, which is sometimes a prism. Yeah. And they have no other access. You could tell them, you're the greatest person, right? And all they hear is, he's trying to lie, he wants my money. You understand? There's no other prism. Why? Because at some point in life we create what's called a self-concept. How do I self-conceptualize myself? How do I see me? I don't even know this. These are the unconscious kalim that define everything, and everything is filtered through that. Some therapists like to call it the story you always tell yourself about yourself. That underlies everything. There's a story you tell yourself about yourself, and anything anybody will ever tell you about anything is filtered through that story. So if that story is very deep down that I am, let's take a classic one, I am valueless. I have absolutely no value. Yeah? Nebuchaher, Nebuchahin. But that's the story. That's the story. So you could write Nebuch, but it's still the story. And I absolutely have, there's nothing, my opinion doesn't matter, my life doesn't matter, my identity doesn't matter, my emotions don't matter. It barely even exists. I'm just here as some, Shmata is not good. Shmata at least has an identity. Shmata, you could clean a counter with a shmata. Shmata has no value, right? A doormat even has value, but this is even less. So ultimately, this becomes like a blockage that everything is channeled through it, but I'm not even aware of it. And yet, in a very sad way, this is basically the untold truth that defines my own identity. Now, of course, this is only in my mind, but the fact is that in my mind, this is how everything gets filtered. So your spouse may share something with you. You didn't even hear what she said. You heard what she said based on the filter that everything gets filtered through. It goes through a screen, and in that screen, it completely is transformed, and therefore you respond in a way that may be completely irrelevant to what this person said. And they don't even know why you're responding this way. You may respond with tremendous anger, or with tremendous sadness, or with tremendous jealousy, or with tremendous hatred, or with tremendous frustration. And the reason is because you didn't even hear what I said. So this is just another marshal of how sometimes an entire identity, right, its entire consciousness is based on the fact that the information that feeds its awareness went through a particular keli, which may sometimes be abuse, or lack of nurture, or some other challenges that a person has. And what now becomes your challenge? Your challenge in life is to be able to identify that. To be able to say, I hear everything through this prism. Once I'm aware of it, right, I can already see how it's getting locked, it's getting restricted. It's like a mouse trap. It comes into this place and it gets trapped, and that's it.
You have to go out of yourself, otherwise it's thinking with that same...
You're right. You have to be able to see above your keli. No.
How could one see above their gate?
How can one see above their kalim?
Get married.
Go out of your body.
You sometimes need feedback from somebody else, right? That's where the teacher comes in. That's part of what a teacher is.
How about challenging your own assumptions?
Yes, challenging assumptions.
So the teacher, actually, the marshal is better than we think, because the teacher actually does have to sometimes create the keli,
Yeah.
not just deal with it.
Yes.
I think you made the point once where you said a person has to make a macha.
Yeah.
Dysfunction.
The Pinchas Karitza. The Pinchas Karitza, yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes people in your life take you out of your gate.
Yes.
What's the story with Scores?
No, I once said in a shir, he says about the Baba Basra and Chaskas Sabatim, right? A macha. That every 3 years you have to make a macha. There's a whole parak in Baba Basra, Chaskas Sabatim. And one of the main issues over there is that when somebody moves into a house, what do they call it? A squatter. And after some time, he claims it's his house. Or his garage, or his hut, or whatever it is. And there's no proof, right? So if he's been living there for 3 years, it's called he has a chazaka, meaning the halacha will assume that it's his house. So the question is why? And the answer, of course, is because why didn't I protest it for 3 years? We're not talking about the guy was in a coma for 3 years and he couldn't protest it. We're talking that he could make a macha, even if he was away, chavri. Why didn't he make a macha for 3 years? It's your house and somebody else is there. At least tell somebody. Go to shul, tell a friend, make a macha, protest.
At least charge him rent.
If there's a star in this, then you don't have an issue. We're talking about that you don't have these documentations to prove it.
Today, eminent domain.
If you have a deed, you have a deed. Eminent domain. Yeah. So Pinchas Koritzer said, he's a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, he said a beautiful word in Avodas Hashem. He was explaining the Perek, Al Pi Pnimius, we're speaking about Mashal and Nimshal. He said it's really a Mashal for Avodah. And that is sometimes you don't have control over your life. There's a squatter who went into your system, like a foreign squatter went into your system, and he took control over your brain, your heart. At least make a macha. What strikes the? At least make a macha. Clap on the tish and say, you're a squatter. He says, that's the problem. I don't care that you have a squatter. You could take it over. But why didn't you make a macha? Yeah? It's a very deep word. Protest it.
Is that what the Alter Rebbe is saying in Tanya when he says to scream against it?
Yeah, make a macha, yeah. I think that's where I said the story.
The issues when you let them live there rent-free. You charge them at least. You have something for it.
Well, he doesn't want to pay, but at least make a macha, protest. In other words, the fact that there's a bunch of squatters in my brain who want to take over, okay. Fine, of course they do that. Why shouldn't they do that? They see a nice, beautiful house. It's geschmack to be there, right? They know that the guy is not going to do anything, so they move in. But protest it. There's a beautiful story about the Mezritcher Maggid had a student, Ze'ev Wolf of Zhitomir. Zhitomir is a city in the Ukraine. And his name was Reb Ze'ev Wolf of Zhitomir. It was a sefer of his Oyer HaMeir. Oyer HaMeir. A Chassidic work that was written by one of his students. Reb Ze'ev Wolf of Zhitomir was a holy man, and one night there was a Jew who came to the Maggid of Mezritch, and he said that he has no control over his life. He has all what we would call today impulses and addictions and inclinations. He doesn't know what to do. So the Maggid told him, go to my student Reb Ze'ev Wolf of Zhitomir. Go to him. He'll direct you. So he takes a trip in the Ukraine. Mezritch is also in the Ukraine. So he goes from Mezritch or Rovna, wherever the Maggid was then. He was Mezritch, Rovna. And then he went to Anipoli, and then he went to Zhitomir. When we went last time to Ukraine, we stopped in Zhitomir. So he comes to the Ze'ev Wolf's house. Where's his house? And he happened to come in the middle of the night, and it was a wintry night in the Ukraine in the 1700s. It was cold, freezing, and he himself was cold, this man. And he knocks on the door. There was no answer. No answer. And he's knocking and knocking and knocking. He sees there's some lantern or candle burning, so he knows that somebody's up, and this house has a resident. It wasn't a person leaves the house for a week and leaves the electricity on. It's the 1700s. He saw somebody's there. Or he saw a shadow. But nobody's answering. And I clapped, and I clapped, and I clapped, and he's freezing. And after a long time of waiting and clapping and begging and nudging, finally Reb Ze'ev Wolf of Zhitomir opens the door. He says, Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. What brings you here? So he says, the Maggid sent me. Why did the Maggid send you? So he tells him the Maisa. Okay. Anyway, he's in his house, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Finally, he turns to Reb Ze'ev Wolf and he says, I came here for a purpose. Maybe you can answer the question. He says, I didn't waste time. I answered the question right away. You didn't even have to come into the house. You could have gone home. He says, where'd you answer the question? He says, what happened when you came? He said, I was very frustrated with you. Very not nice what you did. I knocked and I don't know why, but you didn't open the door. He says, no, that's why you were sent. It was my house. And my house, I decide when I open the door and I let somebody in. And I don't open the door and I don't let somebody in. You could have made an about face and go back to Mezritch. You already got your whole answer. Now, what does this mean? It's not stam of art. There's a profound message here. I can't always prevent somebody from knocking on the door. Sometimes they clap. It doesn't stop clapping. Some people clap 24 hours a day and they don't get the message to stop. Clap, 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 clap. So people think because somebody's clapping, you got to open the door. You don't have to. Who said you have to open the door? Maybe your avoid is to be able to tell the clapper, thank you very much for the rhythm. Very nice. I appreciate your symphonic skills. But this is my house. I'm not opening the door. In other words, being a master of your life doesn't mean eliminating every squatter, and every knacker. There are going to be those who pound your door, and some of them won't stop pounding. But you still have the choice to say, it's my house. I'm not opening the door for you. We often think that if you have toxic thoughts or depressing thoughts or feelings, it delegitimizes what's happening inside. That's not true. That's coming from an assumption that perfection, that meaning equals perfection. That's completely not the case. Meaning rarely equals perfection. In this life, meaning does not mean perfection. Living a wholesome, happy, meaningful life means identifying that which is really valuable and choosing what you will allow to come into your house and call your own, and what you will keep outside of the door, even if in the Nimshal he's already living in the house. But at least you'll make a macha. What if he gets into the house already? So that Pinchas Karitza says, at least make a macha. There are those on the level who don't let him into the house. What if he got in already, broke the window? At least make a macha. That's what the Gemara is saying in Cheskes Abatim. Huh?
Uninvite him.
Yeah. Uninvite him, yeah. Unlike, what do they do? I unlike you. Yeah. Yeah, at every shear you can make like or unlike, right? Arrow up, arrow down. At least do arrow down. It's not, YouTube may not delete him from the existence, right? But you don't have to become a victim of it. And this is a very important yesod in life. People think, I have thoughts like this, okay, so you have thoughts. So every thought is a knacker. So it hacked and cup, exactly. It knacks and knacks and knacks and knacks. And you have to choose what to let and what not to let.
Once you get into an argument,
usually arguments are futile. But it's your house. That's what this is my house.
Your house, you need to be able to moderate. It's up to you.
But so for this, you have to know two things. First of all, that you have a house. Second of all, that you own it. Third, that you have a right to say no. All these things are often not under question. They're under scrutiny. I have a house. I don't even exist. How can I have a house? Even if I exist, I have a house. Really? Who said that? The bank owns my house. I don't own any houses. And even if I have a house, I have a right to say no. Sounds like communism. Huh? Yeah, exactly. Communism. Nobody has a home.
So you said this 200 years before anybody spoke about cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
He was talking.
Yeah. Cognitive behavioral therapy. This is 200 years before, but this is really it's a very deep process. It sounds simple, but it's not so simple, because the knacker, the guy banging, you don't think he's outside of the house. You think he's the owner. He's banging so hard, you're like, oh, it's probably his house. Oh, what am I doing here? Let me leave. Let him come in. And you leave, you become a homeless beggar somewhere in a subway, and he takes over the house. Now, of course, this he is not a stranger. This he is just you. Just a different part of you. You take the house and I'll leave you. Lev Yitzchak of Baditchev, once before Hakafas, he was by the Stende, they were ready to say Atar Reisa. The Baditchev, the Kedushas Levi, and he had his talus over his head. It was after Maidav, Hakafas, and he wasn't starting. He wasn't starting Atar Reisa, and all the Chassidim, his Talmidim, and Shulam, Baditchev, also in the Ukraine, were waiting, and they subst under the talus. It's like he's talking to somebody. Something was going on under the talus. They didn't know what. Suddenly, Reisub Aditsheva gave a scream and says, "Du bist a Lamden, du bist a Gon, du bist a Chassid. Zog du Atar Reisa. You say Atar Reisa." They took off the talus and he left. So this startled everybody even more. So they asked him later, "Who are you talking to?" So he said he was about to come to stay on that Teresa. Yeah. And suddenly there's a visitor. The knacker. The knacker is there. He's there. And he's a Balabatovitzich. I said, "What are you doing here? It's Simchas Torah." He says, "This is me. This is my show." He says, "But I've learned the whole year." He says, I was there in the learning. I davened. I was there. He says, I was by my Rebbe, by the Maggid. He says, I was there. So he says, du bist the Lamden, du bist the Goen, du bist the Goen. Sag du Atar Reisa. Have a good day. You say Atar Reisa. But there's the honesty and the integrity to be able to identify this. And to be able to say, yeah, there's somebody knocking on the door, or there's somebody, even a squatter in my house, who I can't get to leave, right? Because sometimes I can't get it to leave. And yet, not allowing that to delegitimize the fact that you are the owner of this home, and you define, ultimately, the journey of your life, at least through making a macha. And that's extremely powerful. It's extremely valuable. Shouldn't underestimate. So, Mela, what all of this requires one thing: to be able to see the keli that filters all awareness in life and enters your brain through that keli. That awareness is extremely precious because it allows me to choose. It allows me to see, maybe it's time to expand my keli. Maybe it's time to open myself up. Maybe it's time to be able to differentiate between the squatter and me, between the guy banging on the door and the guy inside the house. Maybe I could differentiate between the two. The moment you could differentiate between the two, then you could be a balabas. Then you could own a house. Till you can't do that, then you can't own a house. Everybody will own it besides you. You can't own a house. And it's not an easy process because instinctively we surrender the house to the knake. Because he really owns it. He's so good, he's so loud, he's so convincing. And remember, that's the most ancient voice we hear. So we say, oh, it must be his house. I'm just, I am the Ganav. Ich bin the Ganav. I'm the Goslin. It's all yours. Rather than really identifying a different process. I'm giving a marshal how we all know that identity, right, is completely based on the certain story I have told myself. But the truth is, it's not. It's just my story that I tell myself. And even then, it's so powerful. Why? Because this is the energy filtered. Now let's talk about it in a functional way, not in a dysfunctional way. If the teacher's marshal creates the student, that's the level of reality he could perceive. So that is what creation is. When we speak about worlds, souls, angels, heichalas, oilamus, Histalshalus, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzira, Asiya, Doimim, Tzemeh, Chaim, Edab, every person is different. What does it really mean? In spiritual language, it basically means every nivra has its kalim. And the keli, the mashal, it's every nivra has his mashal. The story, the allegory, the parable God used when he wanted to create you. Just like a teacher comes to a certain audience. Huh? Only Maamar. Okay. But there's the parable the student uses, the teacher uses. We all know that every student needs their own teacher, right? We speak about yeshivas and yeshivas. Really, the best system is every yeshiva has one child. Every child needs their own teacher, their own morah, their own mechana, their own principal, and then you need also social life. The problem is the budget. So we put 30 into a room and figure it out. Okay, fight your way through and hopefully you'll emerge successfully. Every teacher, every student needs his mashal. That works. So every nivra has his mashal. In other words, what's the mashal? The mashal is the type of energy that is filtered. And when that energy emerges through this screen, this is the reality that is created. What is this reality? It's entire reality. It's physical properties, spiritual properties, biological properties, emotional properties, the entire brain and mind and soul. Exactly the setup, the design is a direct product emerged from the screening of this earth through this particular tzimtzum and halal. And this creates this type of nivra. These are his kalim. This is the identity in which he or she operates. And then there's, of course, the common denominator. It's all products of Asiya, all products of Yitzir, all products of Ri, all products of Atzilus. But within each world itself, you have endless products.
In real life, can you reach that without others?
Huh?
In real life, if you reach that without
Oh, so the whole Chiddush is going to be here. can you go out? Can you go back up? The whole idea here that's being conveyed is that the mashal is only a mashal. In other words, that the reason it's this way is because you can always go back to the nimshal. Through the mashal, you can always get back to the nimshal. In other words, what seems like a concealment on one level is really only a tool of revelation. Huh?
That's the tachlis.
It's about realignment. It's about alignment. Alignment doesn't come from obliterating the keli. Alignment comes from realizing that the keli was never blocking. Just from my perception. It was just blocking from my perception. Okay, we'll see. We'll see.
Tell us real. We must have out.
This is the wrong real. What's the benefit of walking so many issues?
Because the other way is painful.
What?
Without it, it's painful.
It's the opposite. This is not painful.
You're asking a good question. What's the benefit of knowing any of this? Of doing the work, I understand, not just listening to a class. Of doing the work.
I was saying, what's the benefit? Coloring is the time you don't work.
The truth is that itself, is a process where one person stands. For one person, as you just said, it's an issue of pain. The alternative is too painful. A person feels that his entire life is defined by anxiety, by melancholy, by frustration, by sadness, by never actualizing who he is. So, just living in that prison, he feels like he's in a prison, and he can't get out of it. And everything is defined by that prison, and he just wants to throw away the chains. He wants to unshackle himself. That's for one person. Another person, what's painful for him is not knowing the truth. It's also, he wants to know the truth. He wants the truth. He wants the emes. He wants the pnimis. And the two are connected, of course, because not being connected to your truth is painful. I think one of the deeper aspects here is, and I think every person has to give that answer for themselves. And the truth is, some people do say what you say. It's completely irrelevant. I just want to make a paycheck and get to bed early. And it drives a lot of people. That drives people. But very often that itself is a response to a certain resignation. It's really, I would say, ultimately to discover who you are, to discover what reality is. Yeah.
Why is it so hard to get to the truth instead of starting from the other way around?
Well, it's Archaizer. It's you gotta go back. The ladder goes two ways, right? The earth comes down.
Designed that way?
System designed which way?
Yeah, we have to struggle so hard. Why isn't it more excessive?
You need to go back up. That's going to be the next subject in the Maamar. That's a good question. Why is it so hard to get back? The truth is, what we call hard in some ways is also easy. What's hard is the habit that I'm not used to it, right? But there's something called a flash, a light bulb goes off in your brain, yeah? When the student suddenly sees it from the perspective of the teacher, it's all gone. With mashal from the Baal Shem Tov, you know, the Talmud Yaakov Yosef brings that he heard from the Baal Shem Tov. A very deep mashal. There was a king, and he invited any subject to come visit him. And they came, but around the palace he had 7 walls, and you had to climb each wall. The problem is, when you came down, there were beasts and thieves and barbed wire. It was just impossible. So everybody stopped. One guy made it one and stopped. And he says one fellow got through. He just went. And when he came to the other side, he saw there was an optical illusion. It didn't exist. That's what he heard from the Baal Shem Tov. What's the Havana? Okay. Huh? No. Huh? Okay, we're learning, but it's just what?
Let us sit for the day right here.
You have to question everything. You question its reality.
Yeah, same thing. The water. It was a test, but when he passed it, it was not there really, because it was only there to stimulate his creativity. So after explaining at length the whole mashal that we have been exploring, where all of the concealments of a teacher who's communicating with a student in a way that is suitable to him, all of the what we call tzimtzumim and halemus and hesterim, the restrictions, the concealments, the obstructions, the filtering, the screening of all of his words and ideas so that it's communicated to the student in a proper way, in a way that he could receive it and grow from it, and even more enclosed in metaphors and parables so that he should be able to experience the idea in a tangible and concrete way, are really not concealments, as explained, because their sole purpose is really communication, gilui. There's no holding back here. The entire holding back is only a mechanism. It's, as we would say, a hechi. The yeshiva shaloshin, the hester is a din in the gilui. The hester is a hechitimtza of the gilui. If you want to give, you have to hold back. Not because you want to hold back, because you want to give everything. And if you give everything, you give nothing. You lose the person. I knew a professor, it just came to me, I knew a professor. He passed away a few years ago. His name was Velvel Green. Velvel Green worked for NASA for many, many years. And one of his positions was during the 1950s and 1960s, when space travel was just beginning to develop, and it excited the world. They would ultimately land on the moon. So he had to figure out the microbes, the various bacteria and germs that you have to deal with when you get there. The problems down here are one issue, but what happens when you get there? So that was his field of research. Not too many people are into that research. And he did it for years and years and years. He was a respected scientist, a secular Jew. He lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. Towards the end of his life, he moved to Israel. He became a professor in Ben Gurion University in Beersheba. At some point in his life, in the 1960s, the early 60s or mid-60s, he met a Jew in Minnesota who was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's shliach in St. Paul. His name was Rabbi Moshe Feller. And they befriended each other. They started to develop a relationship. He started to learn more and explore Yiddishkeit. And he came to visit the Rebbe in Brooklyn and was very impacted by him. And started a long correspondence back and forth. And ultimately, after a few years, he embraced Yiddishkeit slowly. He embraced Yiddishkeit, put his children into a Jewish school, and kashrus and Shabbos and etc. But he was a real scientist, so he was combative. So in the beginning of the relationship, he asked Rabbi Feller, "How can it be that intelligent people don't believe in evolution? That we have evolved from the whole process of Darwin's evolution, natural selection, which has been proven according to so many scientists, etc. But Feller is a very humble person. He said, "Listen, you got the wrong guy. I'm not very familiar with this. Certainly not on your level. You're a scientist. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe is quite knowledgeable in these areas. Why don't you write him? Write him." So he wrote the Rebbe a very long letter. I heard this from Velvel Green. And it was what you would call I don't know if you want to call it an arrogant letter, a chutzpahdik letter, or a very abrasive letter. And in the letter he wrote that I have seen things that you have said or wrote about evolution. Because the Rebbe felt strongly that scientifically there's no real proof for it. It requires also faith. And I want to suggest to you that you stick to things that you know. Teach religion. Don't teach science. Because your ignorance that emerges is staggering. And it just puts you in a bad light. Why don't you stick to the world of religion? Just preach what you're familiar with. That's your expertise. Let scientists deal with science. And he wrote a very long letter, quote unquote, refuting everything he has read or heard from the Rebbe's letters or talks to other people from the previous years. Because the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote to quite a few people about this. This was one of the sugyas in the 50s that was hotly debated and discussed and explored. And a very, very sharp letter, and how it turns him off, and it's intellectually dishonest, and Yiddishkeit has its merits, and you don't have to mix and become an expert in this area when you don't know anything about it. Okay. In the letter at the beginning of it, he also wrote some personal things. The Rebbe wrote him back. I received your letter, thank you, etc. I was so gratified to hear that in the summer you put your children into a Jewish camp in Minnesota, and he goes on with children and education, the Mile of Camp, and summer, and what you should do this summer. Not a word like davar, but like chatzi davar about his message. Good. He writes another letter. He felt a certain closeness, but just this area he could not tolerate. The next letter also nothing. Another letter. He had a lot of correspondence very often about a lot of things, about Israel, about NASA, about all these types of his life. So he thought that this was the Rebbe's way of conceding. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was a big personality. He felt maybe it's not so dignified for him to say, I know nothing about science, and you're right. But it was his way of, okay, I got it. I got your message. Maybe I agree, maybe I disagree. Years later, Maamar years later, I heard this from him. The Rebbe wrote him a letter. He switched his kids to camp, switched his kids to Jewish school. And then years later, once he was completely involved in Yiddishkeit, a full Shema Torah mitzvah, I already knew him years later. Got bombarded with payas. I mean, he was a professor of science, of chemistry or some other stuff. I don't remember. But he told this to me. Years later, he receives a letter from the Rebbe. And he says, a few years ago, you wrote me a letter about this and this topic, and I wanted to clarify to you my position. And he writes him a long letter responding to every one of his questions. And it was very not personal that I shouldn't, but it was just responding the inyan, to all of his questions. And why, therefore, he maintains his position, and he thinks it's, as he puts it there, it has nothing to do with faith. It has to do with science. He says, this is not my position, is not based on a particular preconceived reality, but it's rather, I think, good science when I'm arguing. I'm not arguing based on religion, I'm arguing based on science. And he went through a whole letter. Velvet Green liked what he wrote, but he wrote back to him, I don't understand. I attacked you, I criticized you years ago. What, you just came up with these answers years later? Why didn't you answer? So the Rebbe wrote back to him and said, I would have answered you then, I would have won an argument, but lost a Jew. He said, my mission in life is not to win arguments. I want to ignite Jews. That's why I didn't answer you. Now, that's, I think, a very classic example of holding back because you want to give much more. This is real holding back. It's not just a tzimtzum. It's not just saying it in a nice way. It's saying nothing. It's really confessing ignorance to the point that in the student's mind, you absolutely know nothing, and you went down your tree, and I'm happy, and fine, and you're a nice guy, and let's move on with other issues, right? It's not just holding back. It's holding back in an extreme way. But the entire holding back was really a form of communication. Because I wanted to ultimately, in life, there's people who want to win arguments. Fine, you could win an argument, lose an argument, win an argument. If that's the objective, that's the objective. I expressed myself and I won the argument. If the objective, though, is the student, if the objective is the person, then it's a completely different cheshbon. And then real giving is always holding back. Not because you want to hold back, because you want to give. And if you give too much, and sometimes if you give at all, you lost it. You lost the plot. Because at that point, he realized it's very defensive, when you get into an argument and it's confrontational, and everyone is just waiting for the other person to finish their point so I can prove my point. There's no element of listening. Sometimes we've stayed away from this metaphor for a while so we could bring it in. But there's something called couples. And very often they get into this argument routine, and it's not about communication anymore. It's not even about winning the argument, because you're not going to. It's just about expressing the argument. I don't even winning an argument shena madrega. At least I want to win. Here I'm not. I just have to express it. I'm not thinking about you. Winning an argument is already an intellectual. There's something called sparring and debating in the institutions of academia. They spar, you debate. You want to win an argument. It's a good debate. It's not so much hashpah. But here I'm just expressing myself. It's like when two people are screaming and you can't hear anybody. The main thing is I expressed myself. So I feel better. But real hashpah, therefore, is about gilui, giving. But real gilui is always about holding back because you want to give, not because you want to hold back. And therefore, it's essentially not a hester, it's not a hella, because it's not just, it's tachlis is gilui, it's mitzias is gilui. It itself is a form of revelation. I'm channeling, it's like, if you're familiar with irrigation, with the processes of irrigation, they'll have a large lake or stream or river or source of water, and then you have to dig, right, narrow canals, ditches, they call them ditches, in the earth to be able to channel the source of water. Why do you need these narrow canals? Because if you just open up the source of water, you're going to flood your fields. So somebody's going to say, why are you holding back water? Why don't you irrigate? I'm not holding back water. I'm building these walls or these ditches that are very narrow. I'm not holding back water. I'm giving water to my fields in a way that it could promote growth, not that it'll just drown the field. And the main thing is there's a lot of water. So the trickle is necessary in order to give. But is even more, it's not I want to give something, I want to give everything. And that is why in the contained and limited knowledge he puts in the entire depth, allowing the student ultimately to unravel from what he got to go back all the way to the space where the teacher was and is pre-tzimtzum. In the words of the Gemara, Achar loikayim inish adaita derabe ad arbayim shnin. It takes sometimes 40 years to be able to revisit the idea and get it the way it was in the das of the Rebbe. For 40 years I also understood, but I ultimately understood it post-filter, post-screen. I only saw it from one side. After 40 years I can get it to the other side. And then see how all the mashalim and all the metaphors and all the parables were really just manifestations of the full depth, the way it was in me. This is all the mashal for understanding the entire existence, the entire cosmos. As we explained, there's the two forces represented by Havaya and Elikim. We call them two only because in our world they're two, from our perception. From the teacher's perception, it's a completely different experience. From the teacher's perspective, there's no mashal and nimshal. The mashal is just the incarnation of the nimshal in different language. It's all one, because he comes from the inside out. For him, the concealment is just the way of communicating the deeper idea, and the depth is always there, even in the mashal. The full nimshal is always present, as discussed at length. So the same is true in Havaya and Elikim. That Havaya represents Oir. We explained what Oir is. Oir me'ein ha-moyer, Oir davik b'moyer, Oir ein soif, infinite, indivisible, undefined. The challenge of Oir, of course, is it doesn't allow for the existence and emergence of identity. Every world is based on yesh, and every world is based on gvul, identity and finiteness. There's categories, there's definitions, even the most spiritual world. It's Elikim, which channels the Oir into Kalim, and creates Chachma, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, which is divine energy. But it's divine energy that is restricted and defined and somewhat, we can't call it mamish finite, we're talking still Atzilus, but somewhat finite, relative at least. And then there's more Meshalim and more Meshalim and more Meshalim, as he says, Chitzoni Yisakelim, and Parson, you go to a lower world, a lower world, a lower world, a lower world, and each Keli, according to its dimensions, give the Oir a certain shape, a certain character that allows for the emergence of a particular type of existence, a particular type of world, a particular type of nivra, a particular type of soul, a particular type of angel, a particular type of heichel, a particular type of sphera, mida, koyach, human being, organism, or any force in the world, spiritual or physical, is ultimately the product of what? Of the individual tzimtzum and helam of that oir through the keli, which allows for the existence of the identity that the keli intends to have, that Hashem wanted should emerge. And the mashal that you give for one student can't be the mashal that you give for another student, because it's different brains. It's not one was called one size fits all. One size fits all works when you want to express yourself. I just have to express myself. I don't even have to express myself. I just have to feel that I'm expressing myself. But when it's about being absorbed by the makabel, it can't be one size fits all, because they're not made of one size. You can't have the same shirt, the same pants, the same shoes fitting everybody.
But wouldn't each makabel anyways accept it the way they accept it? So you can say one thing about everybody their way?
You said that yesterday also. L'shitase. That's also true. But as we know, if you have the world of Atzilus, the world of Bri, the world of Yetzirah, there has to be a common denominator between all the Mekabelim in order for them to be able to hear it and receive it the same way. If everybody understands English, right, and understands the basic language, then you could say this person. What happens if you have one person there who doesn't understand English? Then you can't say, just speak, he'll take it in his own way. He's not going to take anything. So if the Ur doesn't go through the Keli, you're right. In a world where everything is in the Zelba category, there's many differences of how each one receives it. That's true. But when you have something that it's of a completely different nature, you have to have a whole new tzimtzum, but it should be able to exist. And here is the key that we have to recall, which I mentioned. And this is, as I said, it's abstract, so you have to connect the mashal to the nimshal. That the mashal falls short in one drastic area. That the teacher doesn't create the student. I don't create my student. In Yiddish there's an expression, a kop kemen nicht arufstellen. Teachers used to say, what does it mean? A kop kemen arufstellen means, so people often took it in a derogatory way. You know, there's a guy has to have a head and then I could teach him. I can't create a head. But in Chassidus, it's brought a lot. And it brings out the point that a good teacher is always dealing with something that's there. You have to work with it. You have to develop it, mentor it, grow it. But you're working with something that's there. You can't create something from nothing. What if you knew that your shiur, your message, is not giving knowledge to the person, or inspiration to the person, or guidance to the person, or challenging? It's actually creating the person. And it's hard for us to conceive. It's just like real science fiction. But what if your words, right, are not just being given to a makabel? The words are creating the makabel. They are creating the makabel. So what does this mean? This means that the type of makabel that's being created is the type of words that are being communicated. So here, it's not the mashal is suited for the makabel. It's the mashal that creates the makabel. His very existence, and therefore parameters of existence, are defined by this mashal. So then, what this means is that each of us has a certain consciousness. We operate on a certain level of consciousness. If you look at a butterfly, it operates on a certain level of consciousness. A bee operates on a certain level of consciousness. A hyena, or a rhino, or a cheetah, or an antelope, they operate on their, or elephants, they operate on their level of consciousness. They don't. You can't come to the elephant and say, "Come see the world from my perspective." The elephant will say, "Let me show you the world from my perspective." You may not want to see that, hanging from his tusk. But this is his layer of consciousness. Can he develop? Of course he can develop. He can be healthy and he can grow within that layer of consciousness. But what is it based on? It's based on the fact this is his brain. And this is how awareness is filtered. This is how much awareness there is in the animal kingdom. And this is how much awareness there is in the botanic world. And this is how much awareness there is in the mineral world. And this is how much awareness there is in the human world. And this is how much awareness there is in every single world. And then in every individual creature and every individual person. And it's all based on the keli. The keli is not just channeling energy to something that pre-exists. That is its existence. So the definition of existence, the way I know it, is based and is a direct result of the type of tzimtzum and helam and mashal that this went through. And that's why you can't compare the consciousness of the world of Atzilus, the highest world, to the consciousness of Bria, to the consciousness of Yitzira, to the consciousness of Asiya Haruchnis, and then to the consciousness of Asiya Hagashmis. And here itself, there's endless categories. It's not just a different quantity or different quality or a little more or a little less. It's a completely, what is reality in one world, the other world doesn't even begin to have a clue, begin to have an inkling into that reality. Why? Because imagine, this Talmud, his entire access to the information is the mashal. All he knows is the mashal. And when we say knows, it doesn't mean that all he knows. His entire existence is this mashal. That's one side of it. And in that sense, it's very humbling to appreciate this. It's very humbling to be sensitive to this, how small the person is. The chiddush, however, here is the opposite. That in the mashal, on one level, it's the ultimate concealment, and on another level, they have the entire nimshal in the mashal. Which is why, through the mashal, one can ultimately go back to the nimshal. And not just to a lower level of the nimshal, but to the full nimshal. I'm getting this dead stare from a bunch of you, so whatever that means. Zu viel Gilu, ja? Man darf ein bisschen mehr Hester, ha? Zu viel Gilu, ja. So let's see inside. Achine, kol b'chines helen v'hester an al d'shem Elokim. The entire concealment of Elokim, harei legabe atzmus ein sof ein ze meilim a master klal. Just like in the mashal, legabe atzmus ein sof, meaning legabe the core of the oir ein sof, which is the same source that restricts itself. Koyach hagvul and koyach habli gvul are one. Legabe this, there's no hester. The kanal b'mashal, shelegabe amashpia ein shum helam. Umeir etzloi kol oimek sichloi v'chachmasei gamba seichel amatzumtzum b'mashal. By the mashpia there was no concealment because the full depth of the wisdom and the ideas shine, they're present, even in the restricted flow of energy and even in the metaphors. We can understand also the way it is above, meaning by Hashem, the legabi ein sof. When we speak about the infinite ein shum tzimtzum v'hester klal. There's absolutely no such a thing as tzimtzum, no such a thing as restriction or concealment. The ein sof nimtze b'makom hachalol la'achirat tzimtzum k'makedem atzimtzum. The of ein sof is present in the space of emptiness. Chalol means the empty space. Chalol, v'libi chalol. Chalal is the empty outer space. They also call the chalal because of its, emptiness, so to speak. But here, makam hachalol is the place of emptiness. La'acher hatzimtzum, post tzimtzum k'may koydem hatzimtzum, like before tzimtzum. U'k'may shekasuv. So even though the expression makam hachalol comes from the Arizal. The Arizal teaches at Eitz Chaim, a Sefer Eitz Chaim, written by Rabbi Chaim Vital. Now listen carefully. That before the world was created, and when we say before, it means even before was created. You with me?
There was no concept of time.
There was no concept of time, thank you. So even before there was a concept of before, his expression is Orein Soif Hoya Memale Kol Makam Hachalo. The Orein Soif, the presence of infinity, filled the entire empty space. What empty space? The space that, so to speak, would become the space of the universe. There was no space for the universe, but that space, there was no space. It was Ein Soif. There was nothing empty of Ein Soif. We're talking not physical space, but conceptual space.
Physical space was not there.
Right, but I'm saying even space, any form of space, we're talking about the concept, space as a concept. The challenge is, of course, as he puts it, I quote that, there was no room for the universes, because, just to give the most simple illustration of it, even though it doesn't capture the full depth of the idea, but if I'm occupying a chair, you can't occupy the same chair unless I go away. Why? Because the space of the chair is filled. I knew a fellow, he was quite chubby, let's put it that way, mildly. So he would always order on an airplane 2 seats. He lived in Australia, so he had long flights, and he ordered 2 seats. The problem is, once they gave him seats in different parts of the plane, you know what he's supposed to do? That big he wasn't. What happens, forgive the brute illustration, but what happens when somebody fills an entire room? There's no space for anything else. Now you have it in a functional way, you have it in a dysfunctional way, an egotistical way. When somebody's ego fills the whole room, sometimes you come to a meeting and somebody's ego fills the whole room, there's no space for anybody. Sorry, this room is filled with my ego. Like the t-shirt, I'm easy to get along with once you learn to worship me. A Yid once came to the Tzemach Tzedek, to the grandson of the Balatanya, and he said, he came on Yechidus, and he told the Tzemach Tzedek, as the ganze shul tret auf mir, the whole shul where I daven, everyone steps on me, everyone tramples on me. So the Tzemach Tzedek said right away, he said, du spreist sich ois wo me tret is es auf dir. You're so expansive, you're everywhere. Wherever anybody steps, it's on you. For you, somebody else stepping means they're stepping on you. You don't have borders. And of course we know, if you don't exist anywhere, you have to exist everywhere. Think about that. People who don't exist anywhere have to exist everywhere. When you exist somewhere, you can have borders. But if I don't exist, so where are my borders? So my borders are here, my borders are there, my borders are there. So suddenly I'll walk in, people walk in, they see 2 people having a conversation. Who are they talking about? We know who they're talking about. You come late for a shir election, you have to go to the front seat because it's the only seat that's always empty, right? And you have to take off your raincoat, right? There's 2,000 people. Who are they all thinking about? There's only one thing they want to be thinking about, and it's me, and what an idiot I am. So we call that insecurity. The Tzemach Tzedek said, basically, you're everywhere, because what does insecurity mean? There's no place where I could be. So where do I have to be? Wherever I could be, I am. So I must be there, must be there, must be there. So the spreizt sich aus wo mitret. Wherever anybody steps, it's on you automatically, because you're there too, because you have no place. So we understand that all relationships are based on symptom. All relationships is based on the recognition where my I ends and your you begins. And I could create space for it, I could respect it. Which is why, al pi halacha, how you mekadesh anisha, how do you betroth the woman? So the Mishnah says in Kedushin, kesef shtar biyah, money or a document or biyah, intimacy. La halacha, we could do the first two. Rav, Maamar says, Yevamis, Rav didn't accept biyah. Mishum pritzusa, but kesef and shtar is fine. But Nagu, the Rambam says, Nagu kol Yisrael lekadesh bekesef or b'shav bekesef. The minhag by Jews is not to betroth through a document, even though you could write it mekadeshly and give the document. We do it with money or something that's valuable, something that has the value of money, even if it's not money itself. The Ramah says that the minhag b'poyel is to be mekadesh b'tabas, right, with a ring, and the source is from Zohar. The Ramah in Shulchan Aruch says that the source is Yeshlam Tam b'tikkunei Zohar, I think, is Lashnas. One of the ideas behind the ring is this idea. When you look at a ring, you have a graphic illustration of what the Arizal speaks about when he speaks about Tzimtzum. In fact, in Eitz Chaim over there's a picture of how he describes it. Tzimtzum, again, the picture is just a marshal to bring out the point. So he says the Ein Sof. Now, I spoke about an ego, but now we have to go to the opposite. Ultimate truth is truth, and it's infinite. I was giving a marshal, but the marshal and the nimshal here are very, very different. In fact, opposites. Ein Sof was everywhere. What does it mean everywhere? Everywhere was the presence of infinity. So there was no space for the worlds. If something is infinite and limitless, there's no space for anybody or anything at any time or at any space. Because any conceivable space is what? Is filled by infinity. If something is infinite, what does infinity mean? Infinity means that it has no limits. That's what infinity means. So if it has no limits, how could there be anything outside of it? If there's something outside of it, it's one of the two. Either that something is part of it, so it's not something, it's just part of the first. And if it's separate, then the first thing is not infinite. This was the great paradox that the Mekabalim struggled with. How can I exist if God exists? You have to say one of two things. Either I don't exist, which is the conclusion of some people, and even of some philosophies. There's a philosophy in the East known as Maya, which basically says all existence is a delusion. You don't exist. And the closer you acknowledge it, the faster you acknowledge it, the happier you'll be. Just get it over with. You don't exist. Again, end it. You think you exist? Fine, go to a psychiatrist. He also doesn't exist. And together you'll figure out why you think you exist. Where do those thoughts come from that you exist if you don't exist? Okay, akasha. But the point is, that's how they deal with it. The other idea is that God is not infinite. So the Arizal asks this question. These are his words. The Ein Sof filled the entire empty space and there was no room for the worlds. And when you say there was no room, it doesn't only mean there was no physical room. It means there was no place. Means like you'll say in conversations and in yeshiva, in the language of Bnei Torah, you'll say this svara doesn't have a place. What does it mean? Doesn't have a place? Svaras have place. The svara doesn't have a chair. What does it mean? There's no place for this svara. What does it mean? It doesn't mean it doesn't have a physical space. It means it doesn't make sense. When you say it doesn't have place. When I say there's no place for this tissue box, there's no place for you to come in, it means I don't have a physical space for you. Every chair is taken. Standing room only. When you say there's no place for an idea, ideas don't sit on chairs. They don't need space. How many ideas could fit into this room? Yeah, ideas don't need space. They're spiritual entities. When you say there's no space, it means it's mufrach, it's abgefrekt, it's ridiculous, it's absurd. Somebody will say a svar, he'll say, it's senseless. There's no place for it anywhere. There's no place for it because it doesn't exist. So the Arizal says there's no place for the world. In a pre-Tzimtzum reality, the concept of Oilamis didn't exist. Couldn't exist. You couldn't conceive of anything outside of infinity. Why? Because there's only one truth. So what happens? So there's something called Tzimtzum. What's Tzimtzum? The famous concept of Tzimtzum in Teres HaNistan, in Teres HaKabbalah from the Arizal, is that the Orein Soif, as he puts it, Tzimtzum es Atzma. It withdrew itself. It withdrew its infinity from one space, creating a makam achalal, an empty space. Its infinite presence had to withdraw from one conceivable space, creating a makam, a place, where there could be something outside of infinity, or at least something that perceives itself as outside of infinity. That's called makam hachalal, the empty space. And that's where creation happens. Creation happens in that empty space. The image for it is a ring. The ring has an encircling silver, encircling gold or white gold. In the middle is empty. The Chassidus places a ring on the ring of the Kala, on the finger of the Kala. Essentially, it's a perpetuation of the doctrine of Tzimtzum. What is Tzimtzum? Tzimtzum means God, in order to have a relationship, needed to create an empty space that is devoid of his infinity so that there could be room for you. Because if I am infinite, or something is infinite, there's no room for you. So there's no you, there's only me. You with me? So the Tzimtzum allowed the Ein Sof to withdraw, so to speak, into its infinity, creating a Makam HaChalal, an empty space that is devoid of the full presence of infinity. Now there can be a world there. So now you can exist, I can exist, we can exist, all of the universes can exist, and they have their own consciousness, their own identity. How? If God is Ein Sof, God is infinite, how is there an existence outside? And the answer is the Tzimtzum. So every relationship is based on this on some level. A person has to be able to say, I created space for your existence. And it's easier said than experienced. You could say it, but can you experience it? Some people can't. It's very hard for them. Because they may have a trauma that doesn't allow them to create space. As the Tzemach Tzedek says, you have to be everywhere. And if you have to be everywhere, then wherever anybody is, they are automatically stepping on you.
So on that concept, how do you understand then Malikol Aretz Kvodo? If he's drawing himself in that space, then the definition is not Malik, right?
So what you're asking, what does it mean, Maloichal Aretz Kvodo? The word according to this is Kvodo. Kvodo means his glory or his kavod, his providence. In other words, here we come to the big debate. What did the Arizal mean? This is one of the greatest debates in the world of Kabbalah and in the world of Jewish spirituality and mysticism. And the debate took place between some of the greatest minds of Jewish mysticism. The Arizal passed away in 1572, Shin Lamed Beis in Tzfas, Hey Av. In the following century, in the following two centuries, and a little more than that, a huge debate took place between Mekubalim, including already generations right after the Arizal, and later. What did he mean? And the debate is defined in very brief terms. Tzimtzum kipshutai, or tzimtzum shaloi kipshutai. Is the tzimtzum to be understood literal, or is the tzimtzum to be understood non-literal? What would be the difference? Tzimtzum kipshutai means the Arizal meant it kipshutai. He meant that the tzimtzum is very real. Infinity cannot be present in the finite. So God can look at the world, He can examine it, He can judge it, He can survey it, He can be mashgiach over it. One of the early Mekabolim, his name was Rabbi Amnuel Chayriki. He was killed al Kiddush Hashem in the 1700s, around 1740 or so. And he wrote a sefer called Mishnas Chassidim. He was a very big Mekubal from Italy, Rabbi Amnuel Chayriki. He also wrote a sefer Yosher Levav. And he gives an example. He says that Arizal felt that how can the king be in the dumps? You have a palace, and you have outside the palace a pile of dung, ashpa. The king could look at it through the window, but he's not in the place of the dung. That's what he says. That's what Tzimtzum is. He's not in the place of the dirt, of the filth. Why? Because he says it's not covered amal. It's not covered amal. He could look at it, he could see it. If he wants, he could control it, but he's not present there. So Malay Chalar, it's kavayde would mean his hashgacha, his providence. He sees the whole world, but the Ein Sof is not fully present there. This was, you're surprised to hear this, but this was a perspective among great G'dayli Yisrael, Tzimtzum Kipshutai. So the song, Hashem is there, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Up, up, down, down, right? Yeah. You play it on the piano, da, 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 yeah. It's not so pashut, according to this perspective. God intentionally withdrew himself. So the reason says tzimtzum es atzmai, v'nekudehem tzayis, and he created a makam hachalal. This was one perspective. Rab Nuel Chayriki was a great Mekubal, and others also. One of the great personalities who held on to this view was the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon, who wrote a commentary on a section of Zohar called Sifra Tzniisa, also maintained this view. To the point that in Vilna, at some point, this is during the sad years of the Machlokes, they burned publicly a sefer called Savas HaRivash from the Baal Shem Tov in the 1700s, where the Baal Shem Tov adamantly gives the opposite perspective, that some people in Vilna deemed Apikursus heresy. Many were so strong about this position that they felt it was a disgrace to say that the king is in the filth. And this world, even in sophisticated places, is called filth, zevel, ashpa. This was one perspective, and I'm saying about Mekubalim. To the point that in Shar HaYichud ve'emunah, in Tanya, the Balatanya writes, there's a Tanya here. Could you give me the Tanya with it? It's a red sefer. The second section of Tanya, in Shar HaYichud ve'emunah, Perek Zayin, the Balatanya says, when he speaks about this debate, so he says, Yesh lohavin shigigas miktsas chachamim beineihem Hashem yechaper ba'adam sheshogu v'tou b'yunam b'kisvei harizal v'hevinu inyan atzimtzum hamusker sham kipshutoi shakadosh baruch hu silek atzmo yemuhusoi chas v'shalom ha'elam haza rak shemashgiach melmayla b'ashgacha protis al kol ha'yitzorim kulam shebashamayim imal v'laretz mitachas. This is how he describes the shit. From everything I explained in Shar Yichud V'Emunah, you can understand the mistake of some of the sages in their own eyes. May God atone for them, who have mistakenly and erroneously, learning the writings of the Arizal, understood Tzimtzum, literally Kipshutai, that God removed his essence. He writes, heaven forbid, Chas v'Shalom, that God removed his essence from this world. He looks at it from above with divine providence on all creatures from heaven till earth. He surveys it, he has providence over it, he has hashgacha, but he removed himself. That's how he introduces this shitta, which is called Tzimtzum Kipshutai. Tzimtzum is Kipshutai.
How would you diagrammatically represent that? If the circle, what would this be represented by? Some kind of gray, some kind of straight line?
No, the circle is what the Arizal says. The circle is what the Arizal says, and the circle is empty.
So that's Pshuta. How does Pshuta, so it's an empty circle?
It's an empty circle.
So the other,
The Arizal just adds that afterwards, from empty circles, you're not going to get anything. Afterwards, God took a little ray that he calls a kav, and he brought it back into the circle to create and sustain all the worlds.
so it's a ray coming out of
Yeah.
outside.
Out of the outside the circle, there's a ray that comes back in.
First there's a circle,
Yeah.
and then there's a withdrawal,
Yeah.
and then there's a ray
Yes.
that comes back in.
First there's a complete withdrawal, and now it's empty space. And it's literal, whatever literal means. And now a ray comes back in, and God still has full providence, of course. But Atzmusa Musa, his essence, so to speak, the Ein Sof, had to be removed. What do you want to ask Reb Nuchem?
That ray is the tightest, that's what that ray.
That ray is called a kav. The Arizal calls it a kav, which means a line. Which means a line.
And it's through that line that the creation sort of...
Yeah.
Isn't that influenced by non-Jewish philosophy to a certain way that there's a clock maker and a clock and the world...
No, even the opinion that Tzimtzum Kipshuta says that God created, of course, the whole world, and there's Hashgacha Pratis.
The surveyor's view of the world, he's not in the Ashba.
Right.
He's outside.
He's a surveyor outside.
But wasn't that also a concept in...
That's why it says Malay Chalaretz Kevoidai. And the pasuk that says as a Shemayim Vesaretz Ani Malay, I fill earth and heaven, would have to be interpreted as my influence fills earth and heaven. It's my influence. I'm still in charge. Not outside of my domain. No. There's no other God. There's no other God. As he puts it here, in this shitta, that there's divine providence that extends in the entire world, and there's no other God. They don't hold there's another God inside the circle, chas v'shalom. And then there's the other perspective of other Talmidim of the Arizal, and that was that Tzimtzum is not Kipshut. Now, what does this really mean? Let's take the philosophy Tzimtzum Kipshut. What does it mean? God removed himself. You're not dealing with physical space. You're dealing with a concept. And even you're not even dealing with a concept, because even a concept has intellectual space. So what does it even mean, Tzimtzum Kipshut?
Again, the Keli without anything inside will not exist also. Just Keli without the light inside.
Yeah.
Also.
So that was the argument. You can't put infinity into a place of finiteness. It's going to obliterate finiteness. You want a world, you need a world. You want to be Ein Sof, but not here. Be Ein Sof there. That's the drastic idea of Tzimtzum. The drastic idea of Tzimtzum is God had to drill a hole in his infinity. Literally, he had to drill a hole in his infinity. The infinity is hovering around the hole from all sides, but the hole, the space, is empty. And that's where the circus of creation happens. That's where everybody could come in and feel identity and experience identity. That's Tzimtzum Kipshuta. It's interesting, Reb Chaim Volozhiner was a student of the Vilna Gaon, his greatest student, or one of his greatest students. And he has a Sefer Nefesh HaChaim. And there he already maintains the position of Tzimtzum much closer to the Baal Shem Tov. That Tzimtzum is Shaloi Kipshuta. There's still a few arguments, because there's 4 different ways of teaching Tzimtzum. There's 4 different opinions in Tzimtzum. Very briefly, there's a very interesting letter. In 1939, there was a Jew, Reb Itcha Masmid, who was a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab, whose Maamar we're learning, and the Rebbe Rayatz, the 5th and 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was burnt in Riga. He was a great, great man, and he went to visit London. And he spent a few weeks with Rav Dessler, the Michtav Me'Eliyahu. Rav Eliyahu Eliezer Dessler was then in Gateshead, in London maybe, probably before Gateshead. And Rav Dessler was a great man, a great man, one of the big Bali Mus, and he was very, very into Chassidus. Rav Dessler was very, very into Chabad Chassidus. He wrote a letter that the best weeks of his life were the weeks with Rabbi Masmit, because they would take walks and explore Chassidus. Rav Dessler wrote in a letter I saw once. Rav Dessler tried to argue that there's no machlokes in Tzimtzum. It's just different terminology. So there was a Jew from London, his name was Rav Binyaminson, he was a dayan there. So he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1938 or 39, who lived in Paris then. And he writes him back that it's very hard to agree with this position, because in the early generations of Kabbalah, after the student of the Arizal, everybody maintained that there was a real machlokes. And when you look at the Svarim, he says there's 4 possible opinions. I'm just going to mention these opinions. They'll become clearer a little later. I'm just going to mention them. I'm not going to explain them. Opinion number 1 is the most extreme. Tzimtzum kipshutoi in the moir. Tzimtzum is literal in the source, in the essence. Like he says here, he took his essence out of the world. In the moir, in the luminary, in the source. Opinion number 2, a little more, not so intense. Tzimtzum kipshutoi in the oir. Literal tzimtzum, but not in the source, in the light. In the light of Ein Sof. Like the light that came from the Ein Sof. Opinion number 3, tzimtzum shaloi kipshutoi. Tzimtzum is not literal. And when you say tzimtzum shaloi kipshutoi, it means tzimtzum shaloi kipshutoi when you're talking about the moir. But when you're talking about the oir, up there it is. And the 4th opinion, the shit of the Balatanya, is tzimtzum is not kipshutoi, not in the oir and not in the moir. Not in the source and not even in the oir. It's shaloi kipshuta. When you say the word tzimtzum, it doesn't mean literal. It's just it's a word that was used in order to explain a certain concept, but it doesn't mean a real tzimtzum, an authentic tzimtzum. So again, you could say tzimtzum kipshuta on all levels. Everything is mitzumtzum. The oir is gone, and the moir is gone, so to speak, gone from this place. Gone doesn't mean gone. Gone from this place. You could say no, that it only applies to the oir. Right, so in the moir, you don't say there was a tzimtzum kipshuta. You was a say tzimtzum shaloi kipshuta. And in the oir, you say tzimtzum kipshuta. That's a second shitta. A third shitta is that tzimtzum is shaloi kipshuta. In the moir, and tzimtzum is shaloi kipshuta in the oir. That's a third shitta. So this is already much different, because the whole tzimtzum is shaloi kipshuta. And then the 4th shitta, just to clarify, and then the 4th shitta, the shitta of the Balatanya, is as follows. In the moir there was no tzimtzum b'chlal, and the tzimtzum in oir is shaloi kipshuta. So when Arizal spoke about tzimtzum, he wasn't talking about the moir, he was talking about the oir, and over there it's shaloi kipshuta. Now it sounds like some abstract debate, l'may nafka mina. But the truth is it has a lot of nafkaminas, and this will be explored. Okay.
Isn't it a very big difference?
Aren't you like some of God's ability by saying that he cannot be the Ashby, cannot exist? You make a much like the king and Ashby. It's not even close. Not even close to close. A king and Ashby, the king didn't create himself. The Ashby is not hard. But Hashem with Ashby, it's all the same. It's all the one energy. So why do I need to? Why does it? There you go.
You're saying the mashal is not like the nimshal. What do you have to differentiate the melech from the ashba?
In an I think I'm going to that maybe. Because we humans want to legitimize our brain to understand God, we minimize it.
It's a good question. And why don't we just say we don't understand?
No, versta me dan eigenlijk, versta me wat is daar gaan.
Come to that anyway. With all the.
This is it because it should fit in my brain. Ich met mijn kleine moesjes.
Frankskit, the Frankskit.
Our brain cannot perceive independent violence. That's why we cannot. And the definition is already by definition is wrong, right? So with definition of our brain, it's human, right?
That's the definition of it.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.